Mental illness. It's a prevalent issue in our world today. Everywhere you look, you can see politicians discussing it and articles discovering new things. But all of this media coverage would not have been possible without something happening that would really catch public attention. Nellie Bly was a brave journalist in the late 1880s who exchanged her freedom for the chance to explore the horrific conditions of a mental health asylum. She encountered beatings, starvation, and even solitary confinement, but through her writing exposed the truth which sparked reforms in New York and forever changed the treatment of criminals and the mentally ill. Everyone knows someone who has been affected by mental illness, and we found ourselves fascinated with 10 Days in a Madhouse and the rapid development of mental illness treatment in the 20th century. So we did some research, and these were the fascinating things we discovered. Before we tell you about Nellie Bly, let's start from the beginning and briefly review what psychology was based on in Nellie Bly's time, which was 1880s America. As early as 500 BC, there is evidence of early psychology being developed. This interest in human behavior was shared by the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians. For a long time, people believed that mental illness could be attributed to faith and religion, but things for people with mental illness were not so bright. They were often expected to be handled by their family and were oftentimes thrown out into the streets to become homeless. Mental hospitals were put in place, but of barbaric and inhumane conditions, which included abuse by nurses, being physically restrained, and poor nutrition. We asked Professor Osmond at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee about what people knew about mental illness at the time.
Unfortunately, when you start to study these things and start to delve into the complexities of them, you realize that there's more to it than just common sense and good emotional intelligence. And when you try to understand it, you can sometimes get off on the wrong track. Right? So for a while, psychology was on a behaviorist track, radical behaviorist track that said it's all the consequences of your behavior. We can control you. John Watson, one of the first behaviorists, said, you can give me any infant and I can make them into anything that you want. Doctor, lawyer, garbage man, ditch digger.
But social change and reforms were coming, with Nellie Bly leading the way for New York City. Nellie Bly, or Elizabeth Cochran, began her career as a journalist in 1885 at the age of 18 by writing a fiery retort to a sexist article entitled What Girls Are Good For by Erasmus Wilson. In the article, Wilson called the working woman a monstrosity, insisting that they should venture no further than that of the home. She wrote a scathing reply, which she signed Little Orphan Girl. The letter found its way to the desk of George Madden, managing editor of the Pittsburgh Dispatch. He was so impressed by her writing, he asked her to write an article on the women's sphere. Elizabeth agreed and proceeded to write The Girl Puzzle, and so began her rise to fame. 2 years later, Miss Cochran moved to New York and began writing for the New York World under the pseudonym Nellie Bly. One of her first assignments was an investigation of the infamous Blackwell Island Mental Asylum. In order to fully experience the conditions inside the hospital, Nellie decided to masquerade as one of the patients. In the late 1880s, this was not difficult to do.
Back then, doctors were not regulated the way they are today. There was no legal mechanisms in place of any significant variety back in the day.
Besides practicing strange faces in a mirror, Nellie also pretended to have no knowledge of where she came from, continuously changed accents, and pretended that she was waiting for a boat. After being pronounced insane by a judge and a board of doctors, she was sent on her way to Blackwell's Island. Immediately upon arriving at the hospital, Nellie was examined by Dr. Kinnear, who asked her a series of questions, including her name, age, height, weight, and where she was from. After the examination, Nellie and other women were forced into the hallway and made to wait in the bitter cold for half an hour. When they were finally let in for dinner, Nellie was shocked at the poor quality of the food.
Placed close together all along the table were large dressing bowls filled with a pinkish-looking stuff which the patients called tea. By each bowl was laid a piece of bread, cut thick and buttered. A small saucer containing 5 prunes accompanied the bread. I tried the bread, but the butter was so horrible that one could not eat it. I turned my attention to the prunes and found that very few of them would be sufficient. My bowl of tea was all that was left. I tasted it, and one taste was enough. It had no sugar, and it tasted as if it had been made in copper.
After dinner, the women were all led to a cold stone chamber where they were ordered to undress. If they refused, the nurses would use force. They were pushed into large tubs of ice-cold water where they were scrubbed harshly by other patients. There were no towels to dry off with, and Nellie was given a thin slip to put on wet and was again led to a room with rows of beds to lie down on. The beds had no proper covers, only a sheet and a tiny wool blanket. The next day, she was given a coarse calico dress that was too small, and she and the other women were led outside and promenaded around in lines as a form of physical activity. Over her stay, Nellie began to notice that most of the patients were completely sound of mind. Some were only there because they did not speak English and no one could understand them. Along with the horrible food and living conditions, Nellie witnessed the beating of patients.
Soon after my advent, a girl named Urena Little Page was brought in. She claimed she was 18 and would grow very angry if told to the contrary. The nurses were not long in finding this out, and then they teased her. They kept this up until the simple creature began to yell and cry, saying she wanted to go home and that everybody treated her badly. After they had gotten all the amusement out of her they wanted and she was crying, they began to scold her and tell her to keep quiet. She grew more hysterical every moment until they pounced upon her and slapped her face and knocked her head in a lively fashion. This made the poor creature cry the more, and so they choked her. Yes, actually choked her. Then they dragged her out to the closet, and I heard her terrified cries hush into smothered ones. After several hours' absence, she returned to the sitting room, and I plainly saw the marks of their fingers on her throat for the entire day.
After 10 days of brutal mistreatment, Nellie's editors released her, and in the investigation that followed, it resulted in a $1 million increase in the budget for care of the mentally ill. Nellie was not the first person to seek asylum reform, but her article started an investigation into mental hospital systems of New York and did cause reform. Her article caught the eye of the public and caused other cities to adapt their policies. We reached out to Professor Keller of the University of Wisconsin-Madison about change in mental illness during the 20th century. He explained that there were extraordinary changes in the treatment of the mentally ill after the turn of the 20th century. Psychiatrists identified a number of physical dimensions of mental illness, including pioneering work in neuropsychology and biochemistry that indicated the ways in which neurotransmitting chemicals are implicated in many mental illnesses. He also told us that more people began to see mental illness as a physical rather than moral problem, resulting in more compassion when it came to dealing with mentally ill patients. Finally, we asked both professors how mental illness is treated in the world today. Both explained that although there have been countless advancements in treatments, mental illness and psychology are still severely misunderstood by many people. Nellie Bly's investigation of the Blackwell Asylum signified a turning point in the way we viewed mental health. Her writing sparked the interest of ordinary citizens and gave them a push towards compassion and the pursuit of knowledge. However, her struggle to make people understand is still not over, and together we must overcome the stigma of mental illness.